Well, hello. Welcome, everybody. I'm delighted to have you join us today for our webinar. Really excited to talk about light therapy, how to get great results, what it's going to do. But before we get started, I just want to give a couple of quick pointers. First of all, there's a chat feature. I can see many of you already hopping in and telling us who you are, where you're from. Awesome. Glad to have you all here. Oh, look at this. We've got the Caribbean, we've got Norway, South Africa, Denmark, Michigan, Virginia. Wow, this is great. We're glad you're all here. Thank you for joining us. If you have any problem with the broadcast today, first thing to try is simply reload the web page that you're watching this in, and often that'll solve any problems. And the other thing I want you to know is if you have any questions during the presentation today, please type them in the chat window, and you can actually mark them as a question, and we'll try to answer all the questions live today during the presentation. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. My name is Dr. Adrian Larson. I have been using, teaching, and selling light therapy devices for a little over 15 years now. And things just keep getting better and better. So I'm excited to tell you and show you what is the latest. I'll begin with my presentation. Give me a moment here. There we go. All right, light therapy for pain relief. That's why you're here. Let's get right into it. Today's topics that we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to talk about why and how light therapy actually works, what it's doing. Differences between LEDs and lasers. We're going to get into light physics just a little bit, but I promise it's not going to be overly technical. We'll talk about the best lights for each application, energy versus information when talking about lights, how to use it in practice, common mistakes, and how to choose a good device. But first, before we get into all that, I want to talk about the history of light therapy. How we got to where we all are is always a topic that fascinates me, and the history of light therapy is no exception. Now, there's documentation about using light going as far back as 1500 BCE, where light was recommended to treat certain illnesses. And even early in the 20th century, tuberculosis hospitals, one of the major parts of treatment was that they would put people outside in the sunlight with the belief that the light would be helpful. Niels Finsen, a Danish physician, won a Nobel Prize in 1903 for his work in the area, which gave birth to a field that's broadly known as photobiology, or the study of the biological effects of light. Now, interestingly, this field, though it started out with very promising results and very promising information, it was quickly labeled as quackery. After the Flexner report came out, our American Medical Association pretty much labeled everything that they couldn't own or monetize as quackery. And I remember I visited a museum one time. It was a traveling exhibit. I was at a museum, and they had a traveling exhibit for a limited time only, and it was called the Museum of Quackery. That was the exhibit. And they had all kinds of old medical devices and approaches that were labeled as quackery. And frankly, they were kind of mocked. They were saying, oh, look how funny this is. There's, the typical snake oil paradigm, right? And one of the things I noticed was they had a big box with a giant light bulb inside, and then it had a lens coming out the front. And this thing had to have been, 2 feet tall and 2 feet wide with a lens about that big around. And then it had these slides, these acetate colored slides that you could slide in so that when you activated this giant light bulb inside, you could change the color of light that was coming out of the box. And the idea is that you were supposed to sit in front of this box and be stimulated by whatever color of light you chose with the slide. Kind of similar to what you might see in this picture. And this was labeled and mocked as quackery in this exhibit that I saw 20 years ago in a museum. And yet, the more research happens, the more science gets behind this, we're finding out that it was not quackery at all. It was never quackery. And that people who were so quick to label it as such were fools. Although, interestingly, if you go Google light therapy quackery, one of the top results you'll get is a Wall Street Journal article from 2003 saying there's a degree of quackery in light therapy. Well, that wasn't that long ago. And of course, we tend to label anything that we don't know the mechanism for or that we can't own, we tend to label it as quackery. And quackery is just a buzzword that actually started out mocking dentists for using mercury amalgams. But I digress. The point is that if you look at mechanism and you look at money, you can always find out why things are labeled quackery. If they don't know the mechanism for why it works, or if they can't monetize it, well, it's quackery. The good news is that light therapy is absolutely not quackery, that it has been more and more accepted in the scientific literature and in medical circles. Here's a little chart of the number of red light therapy. If you type red light therapy into PubMed and see the number of articles published per year, look at that trend. You can see that it's becoming, just in red light, becoming more and more researched and more studied. And if the research results weren't promising, if it wasn't actually showing any benefit, you wouldn't see this huge upward trend of continuing research. So I think that's a very positive sign for those of us that love to use light therapy because of all its benefits and its very, very minimal downside or side effects. Now, currently in the medical literature, the things that are medically accepted that will be done right now, that are common, even pedestrian for light therapy: atopic dermatitis, psoriasis, vitiligo, acne, seasonal affective disorder, sleep disorders, neonatal jaundice, where they have the billy lights to break up the bilirubin. All of these things are commonly treated with light. Nobody even gives it a second thought. It's just accepted that light of a specific type and of a specific wavelength is the best treatment for these conditions. And so the Museum of Quackery, unfortunately, they need to just quack off. So let's talk about light. Light is a fascinating topic. We're going to get into just a couple of ideas about the physics of light, and then we'll get into the fun stuff about clinical and treatment. But light, as you know, is made up of waves. In the physics model, it's a wave and a particle. It's a dual nature. That's not really important right now. But when you think about sunlight, you look outside, what's coming from the sun is full spectrum light. And when you put that through a prism, then that will separate into its various colors or its various wavelengths, because they're all in that light, all mixed together, and that's why it appears as white. Other types of light, though, monochromatic light, when you run it through a prism, it stays the same color. It doesn't separate because it's only got one color of light in it. So when we talk about the spectrum and we talk about color, we're really talking about what's called wavelength. Or if you misspell your slide, it's called wavelength. The wavelength of light is a fancy way of saying the color of the light. Things that have shorter wavelengths tend to be up toward the blue and violet end of the spectrum, and then they move on up to ultraviolet, which goes beyond the visible spectrum of light. Things that have longer wavelengths tend toward down the orange and red part of the spectrum. And then if you get even longer wavelengths than that, you get into infrared, which isn't visible, but which we do perceive as heat. So we can sense infrared light, which we sense as heat. We can sense visible light with our eyes, and that's the only part of the spectrum that we can actually sense. The next thing to talk about, besides wavelength, and the takeaway from wavelength is simply that wavelength equals color. If you've got that, then the next thing to talk about is something called coherence. Coherence is the measure of how in sync all the light is. So I like to use the example of a rowing team, and they're out there rowing, and they've got somebody that's calling out the stroke, and they're working in perfect synchronicity and perfect unity. And because they're synchronized and because they're unified, then they can move very quickly and very efficiently through the water. And coherent light is much like that. Coherent laser light, all of the waves are in sync. So instead of just randomly coming out, they're all moving together. The waves up and down all together. And therefore, the light is very powerful, because it's one thing to get hit with randomized light particles. It's another when they all hit at once. That's the simplest way to put it. Would you rather have a single paper cut or 1,000 paper cuts? That's the story. So coherent light comes out of a laser, is very powerful, but it's also very collimated. Collimated means that because the light is coherent, it all stays together in a very tiny dot. It's a very straight beam, and it doesn't diverge at all. It all stays straight, which is why when you have a laser pointer, you can shine a dot, and you can shine 100 yards away on the side of a building, and you'll get a dot. Versus incoherent light that's not collimated, it's divergent. Divergent light spreads out. That's your typical flashlight. That's your typical light that's in a room. It doesn't stay in a tiny coherent dot. So it has a larger coverage area, but less concentrated power in one spot. And we'll talk about how to clinically apply both of those in a couple of minutes here. But that's the basics about collimation. And the takeaway from this is that laser light is coherent and collimated. Non-laser light, like LED light, is not collimated. It's divergent and it's not coherent. Both of them, whether you're dealing with a laser or dealing with LED light, both are monochromatic. That just means one color. So you put either one of these in a prism and you're not going to get the full spectrum of colors. But if red goes in, red comes out. Fair enough? All right. When we talk about laser versus LED, then, we come up against the question of concentration. Because laser light takes all of the light and concentrates it in a very small area, then you get a very high dose in a very small spot. And the area that you cover versus the power that's spread over that area determines how deep you're going to get penetration. Laser light, therefore, penetrates deeper than non-laser light or LED light. LED light doesn't penetrate quite as deeply, but you do get it over a much larger area. So when you're thinking about how to treat, one of the things you have to consider is whether you're focusing on a single tiny area with maximum dose, or you want to affect a broader area with a gentler dose. Laser, because it is coherent, it has interesting remote effects. For example, there was a 1991 study done that showed laser light actually travels in the acupuncture meridians. And so when you shine a laser light in one spot on an acupuncture point, for example, and you move further up the channel with a light detector, a photon detector, when you turn on the laser, you'll detect photons further up the channel, that they actually travel through the acupuncture meridians. Really a fascinating notion because it induces remote effects. And then, of course, brain imaging studies have backed that up, that when you're using laser on acupuncture points in the body, that they have the effect in the brain that's similar to using needle remotely. So whether you use needle or whether you use laser, you get remote effects. With LED, you don't tend to get that same thing. LED tends to be more localized effects. This plays in, again, to what your treatment goals are and therefore the type of device. And we'll talk more about how to choose a device coming up. Another consideration when you're thinking about lasers versus LED type devices is you want to think about safety. Lasers, because they are highly concentrated and put a lot of light and a lot of coherent light in a very small area, they can be dangerous for the eyes. And so eye protection is always a consideration if you're using a laser. If you're using an LED where it's more diffuse, then it's not generally dangerous to the eyes, even at high intensities, because it simply doesn't pack the same punch into such a small spot. Now, this is an area that has increasingly become a problem because there are folks every year who get permanent eye injuries from lasers. Sometimes it's just hobbyists that are experimenting around. They go buy a laser online. It's not properly labeled. It's over juiced. It's got too much power. And a laser of high power can, in a couple of milliseconds, do permanent damage to the eye. And so, of course, medical lasers, and particularly low-level lasers like the type you or I would use in practice, don't have that danger in terms of permanently burning the eye in a split second. But safety is always a consideration. Now, when you're considering laser versus LED and light therapy, you want to talk about the area you'll be treating, and you want to talk about the purpose of the treatment. The area you'll be treating, obviously, you're not going to treat anywhere near the eyes with the laser, and you have to decide if you want to treat a large area or if you want to affect a single point. I like lasers for acupuncture points because you can treat very concentrated in a very small area and have a very good effect, versus LED where it's a broad diffuse effect, affecting a large area of tissue. So, with that little primer on the physics of light and how the light is labeled and its properties, let's move into how it works. What is light doing when we use light therapy? Why does it have the effects it have? Well, first of all, obviously, when you use light, and I'm just going to grab a laser and use it for a minute because that is very easy to see. You can see that when I shine a laser on my finger, it penetrates into the tissue, and every cell in that area is getting light. It's getting energy. Light is a form of energy, and it's being deposited in every single cell in the area. There's a science called photobiomodulation, and that deals with the biochemical effects of light, specifically in cellular respiration. Now think back to your biology days. You probably remember cellular respiration takes place in an organelle called the mitochondria. The mitochondria is the powerhouse of the cell. That's what they said in biology class. It's responsible for the production of ATP. And ATP is the fuel that runs every cell in the body. So ATP production takes place at the mitochondria in a process called cellular respiration. And studies have shown that red light of particular wavelengths hits the mitochondria and causes a rapid increase in ATP production. Therefore, you have more available energy for the cell, and therefore the cell, in whatever process it's trying to accomplish, it's well funded with energy. It's got plenty of fuel to do what it needs to do, and fuel does not become the limiting factor, let's say. So another thing that it does, along with increasing ATP at the cellular level, is increases nitric oxide production. You may recall nitric oxide is a vasodilator. It's responsible for opening up the blood vessels so that you get better circulation. And it's lately been an area of study for how to increase nitric oxide levels permanently. It reduces blood pressure, it improves circulation, and it helps with a myriad of health problems. And light at the cellular level has been shown to increase nitric oxide production immediately. Now, depending on the wavelength, remember wavelength means color, depending on the wavelength of light that you're using, you may also have a heating effect in the tissue. Remember earlier I said when we talked about the spectrum of light, we have visible and we have non-visible light spectrum. And the non-visible down at the long wavelength area is infrared, which we feel is heat. Therefore, if you're using an infrared light source, you're going to have a local heating effect in the local tissues that receive that light. And that's something to consider when you're choosing the kind of device you want to use. Because you increase ATP, you increase nitric oxide, and because you have a local heating effect, the sum total is that you increase micro and macro circulation with light therapy. You also increase lymphatic drainage due to the improved circulation, and improved circulation brings a ready supply of nutrients to the cells. Both nutrition going in, waste products coming out of the cell are enhanced when you have plenty of microcirculation, plenty of macrocirculation, and plenty of lymphatic drainage available. And then light has been shown to have antiviral, antibacterial, and antifungal effects. Again, depending on the wavelength of light that you're using. I had in fact, just this week, I was trimming my toenails and I trimmed one too close. And the next day it was really sore. And I thought, oh no, I got a little infection there at the corner of my toenail. And so I've been using a specific wavelength of laser that is highly effective at killing bacteria and treating infection. And so I've just been lasering my toe 2 or 3 times a day. And sure enough, a day later, things are nice and cleared up. So that's one of the ways that you can use light therapy in practice if you know your wavelengths. One other thing you need to remember, because light therapy works at the cellular level, it has a cumulative effect. When you treat with light and you get that instant increase in ATP and nitric oxide, those effects are temporary. It's not a permanent effect. So it's like a short burst, a nice boost, and then things gradually come back down to the normal baseline level. And then it's time for another boost. And so a cumulative effect of using a light boost multiple times per day over the course of several days is the most optimum way to get the maximum effect from light therapy. So a single treatment will have a good effect, but multiple treatments, even better. That's the way that you want to go. The next thing to talk about in the topic of how does light therapy work is we want to talk about the communication aspect of light. When you think about an old style telephone, like the one we see here, and yes, I'm old enough to know how to use one. When you think about that telephone, the energy that goes in those wires, back when phones had wires, is electricity. It's electrical energy. But that's not why you would make a phone call. It's not because you really care about electricity. You care about information. And the electricity carries encoded within it the information so that you can have a conversation with whomever it is you're calling on the other end of the phone. And even now that phones don't have wires anymore, the same thing happens. We've changed the kind of energy. Now we're using radio frequency energy, radio waves, to carry that signal instead of using a copper wire with an electrical signal, but it still encodes and carries the information. Well, light is very much the same way. You can encode and carry information in light. That's how fiber optic networks work. That's how most of the internet is carried around the world. There's these huge undersea fiber optic cables where you have a light on one side of the ocean and it shines thousands of miles to the other side of the ocean where there's a receiver that reads the information encoded in the light. And the light is what carries all the information, and it's very efficient at doing that and very fast. Of course, it's light. So the cool thing about using light for information is that when you inject light into the body, when you actually deposit the energy into each and every cell, if you encode information in that light, you're also communicating information, and you're doing it in a non-invasive way. It's wonderful when you can actually get down to the cellular level without having to do something invasive, for example, piercing with an acupuncture needle. But a non-invasive information transfer, you can encode things in light, This is commonly, in the vernacular, it's referred to as frequency. So people will say, oh, yes, it's got, this frequency or that frequency. And this is a common area of confusion. Frequency, sometimes people think it means the wavelength or the color of light. And without getting into the physics about how that could be applied, in the common usage and the way you and I would talk about light therapy, let's just keep that separation in place. Wavelength is color. Frequency is information that's encoded. And frequency simply refers to how rapidly the light is flashing on and off. So if you have one burst of light per second, that would be frequency of 1 hertz, 1 burst per second. If it's flashing on and off 10 times a second, frequency is 10 hertz, 10 bursts per second. But that wavelength, that could be a red light flashing on and off 10 times. That could be a green light. That could be a blue light. Wavelength has nothing to do with frequency. They're two different things. And some light therapy devices encode information in frequencies to have a better effect. Not only the biochemical effects of the light, but the communication effects of the frequencies. Both take place at once. It's kind of a 2-for-1, and that is part of how light therapy gains so much effectiveness. So with that in mind, with this information, we need to talk about how to use light therapy in practice, and then we'll talk about devices and how they work and what to choose and the differences between them. But the first thing, when you're thinking about a light therapy device, the first thing you've got to consider is, what am I treating? And what other treatments am I going to be using? Now listen, I would love to tell you that light therapy is the end-all, be-all, fix everything. But I'm going to tell you right up front, it's not. And maybe that's a little surprising when you're coming to a light therapy seminar and you're listening to a guy that sells light therapy products. But I'll tell you up front, it's not the panacea that fixes everything. It is a wonderful adjunct to whatever other treatments you're doing. It will make your other treatments more effective. It will give you improved results. But if all you're going to do is light therapy alone, don't expect that you're going to see miracles every time. Sometimes they happen, sometimes they don't. My philosophy is that if you've got a patient who has a problem and needs your help, do everything you know how to do. Give them the benefit of your training. If you're an acupuncturist, do acupuncture. If you're a chiropractor, do chiropractic. And then add light therapy to amplify the results that you're getting. In that local area, having that increased ATP production, that increased nitric oxide production, the information encoded in the light, that only adds and benefits. Now, the next thing is, what are you treating? Is it something that is a local tissue area? Are you trying to get remote effects? Are you treating something that is a surface level on the skin, or something that's deep in the muscles or in ligaments, connective tissue, joints? All of these are going to determine what kind of light therapy device you want to use. So you want to make sure that you're using the right fit. I'll tell you a quick bad story. I read about this in the news a little while back, and this fortunately isn't something that's going to affect any of us, so I feel it's okay to talk about it as a warning to us all. There was a cosmetic laser, somebody that had a cosmetic laser that was designed to do certain things, and some of those are designed for hair removal, for example. Some of those are designed for affecting the skin in certain ways, vitiligo treatments, and so on. Well, the person wasn't particularly well trained and said, oh yeah, no, I have a laser, I can do tattoo removal. And so they got this laser and they had somebody with a tattoo and they treated him and it burned him really bad. And the person who was not trained, rather than saying, well, that seems odd, said, oh yeah, no, that's supposed to happen. Come back next week, we'll do it again. Came back, burned them, and scarred them very badly, to the point that they destroyed the skin and had to have a skin graft because the person was untrained and they were using an approach that wasn't the right approach. So the moral of the story is, you have to know what you're doing and what your device is capable of. What wavelength does it put out? Why does it put out that wavelength? And what is that wavelength designed to do? You don't want to use a surgical laser that's designed for cutting and burning to try to treat, I don't know, tattoo removal or an acupuncture point. The good news is none of that is very hard or complicated to figure out. And I'm going to walk through the most common approaches that are used in the types of things that you and I would do in practice. We got to get into one little funny name thing, the Arndt-Schulz Law of dose, when we talk about treating and we talk about dosing. Before we do that, I just want to hop in and see if we have any questions that have yet been asked. And if I jump in here, we do have some questions. So let me jump in. I'm going to answer a couple of questions, and then we'll get right back into our presentation and get into the Arndt-Schulz Law of dose. Okay, so Azam says, are the effects of the Nogier bar frequencies better with pulsed laser devices or continuous laser devices? The answer to that is you can't have a frequency without pulsing. Remember, frequency is on-off. That's pulsing. So a continuous laser device can't have a Nogier or bar frequency. If you're going to do Nogier or bar frequencies, you by definition, you have a pulse laser device. Next question, what wavelengths are good for specific needs, fungal, bacterial, etc.? A little bit beyond the scope of what we're doing because there are so many wavelengths that have been studied and so many applications. That's going to be something where you'll want to do a little bit of research on your own because there are specific wavelengths for fungal, for antibacterial, for tissue healing, regeneration, etc. All right. Lori says, can you share the slides? And Shireen says, oh, yeah, the slides are going to be in the webinar recording. Everybody will get the recording. Don't worry. Kristen says, what wavelengths are good? Oh, wait, we just covered that one. That was the same, that was the same one. Sue says, when treating an infection, how long is the treatment time? And is it the same amount of time for 3 treatments per day? Okay. So, Sue, let me answer that question by referring to the slide that's on your screen right now. That's a great segue into the Arndt-Schulz Law. What you need to understand with the Arndt-Schulz Law is that the stronger the stimulus, as you start with 0 stimulation and you start to add stimulation, you start to get an effect. And the more stimulation you add, the better effect you have until you hit a certain point where you've maximized your effect. Then, if you keep adding more and more stimulation, the effect drops until you actually do damage. You can do more harm than good by overdosing. I was taught this law, and the way I like to think of it is the law of fertilizer. Suppose you plant a garden and you want beautiful vegetables, and so you add some fertilizer to the garden to help the vegetables grow, to give them the nutrients they need. And you add some fertilizer and you get a nice effect, and the plants are big and beautiful, and you say, oh, I'm going to add more. So you add more fertilizer, and it's not quite as noticeable of an effect. The plants are still nice and big and beautiful, but you don't get that big initial burst. And you say, wonder what went wrong. And you add more fertilizer, and the plants wilt and die because you overdid it, you overdosed them, and actually poisoned them. That's how the Arndt-Schulz Law works. Now, you're not going to overdose somebody with light and kill them, but you do need to understand the right amount. And so with regard to Sue's question, how long is a treatment time, the same amount of time? The question of how long depends on the kind of light that you're using, the amount of area that you're trying to cover. But the trick is you don't want to overdose. I'll tell you a quick personal story about this. Again, I experiment on myself. I use light therapy. And I remember I got a canker sore one time, and those are just miserable. And I thought, well, I'm going to try using a laser because it's supposed to speed up tissue healing. So I'm going to try using a laser on this canker sore. And so I got myself a laser and I shined it on this canker sore. And I would go for minutes a day, just shining, just lasering the heck out of this thing, just bombarding it with high-powered, highly concentrated laser light. And this was before I understood the Arndt-Schulz Law. And I thought, I'm really going to heal this thing. It just got worse and it grew, and it normally that would resolve in a week or something. And this took 2 weeks. I finally quit lasering the thing and it finally healed up. And only later did I understand what I'd done, that I had given it so much stimulation, I had inhibited healing. So the trick that you need to understand is the right dose. And we'll talk more about the equation that you use to come up with the right dose. Right now, you just need to understand that more isn't always better. Okay, other questions. Pulsed versus continuous. We kind of covered that. How deep does LED light penetrate in the body? That completely depends on the power of the light. So LED light in general is not specific enough to say, but certain wavelengths of LED light will penetrate better than other wavelengths. For example, far infrared and infrared penetrate deeper than red does. The color is going to control the biological effect. So the wavelength, in other words, color is wavelength, remember. So blue light and colors in the various blue areas of the spectrum tend to treat infection. They tend to be antibacterial. So you would use blue light for that effect, whereas red light tends to increase ATP production, like we talked about. You would use red light for that effect. So in therapeutic colored light, you care about the color because of the biological effect that it will have. Giovanni also said, can LED light be harmful to the eyes if it is too close to them? And the answer is, yeah, any light that's too bright can harm the eyes. I mean, it doesn't matter if it's laser or LED. You could conceivably produce a light that is powerful enough that it damages the eyes. Fortunately, typical LEDs that we would use in treatment are not going to damage the eyes unless you intentionally try to concentrate it and stick it in the eye, which of course you wouldn't do. All right. We have a question. Can you do light therapy for dandruff? Interesting question. I have not seen light therapy for dandruff. Dandruff tends to be a fungus, actually, and I don't know if there's a particular wavelength effective against that. I do know hair regrowth responds well to light therapy, and there are light therapy devices that help regrow hair quite effectively. What makes your light unit more effective than other lights in the market? Well, we'll get there. We'll talk about that. Are your wavelengths similar to what Erconia lasers use? Some of them are. Erconia has various lasers, of course, but in general, the most common wavelength is a 635 nanometer red. In fact, that's the wavelength that you're seeing right here in this laser. And 635 nanometer is 635 nanometer. It's that wavelength, no matter whose name is on the device. So yeah, some of the devices we have a similar wavelength. And then, let's see. Is the laser light of the red and blue lasers 3A more dangerous to a person who has macular degeneration? Well, first of all, you should not use lasers around the eye at all. And then, depending on the power, yes, you're going to have greater danger with more powerful lasers. Class 3B lasers, for example, are more powerful than Class 3A lasers. A little bit beyond the scope of what we're talking about in today's presentation, but please don't use lasers near the eyes. All right, so much for questions for now. We will get back to more questions in a minute, but we covered the Arndt-Schulz Law. Let's get into how to calculate your power. Power is a component, or is a function of the area, or dose is a function of power, area, and time. There we go. I said it right. So let's suppose you have a light, and let's suppose your light says that it puts out 100 milliwatts. Well, 100 milliwatts just tells the gross amount of power, the aggregate power coming out of the light. But 100 milliwatts spread over a really big area means that any portion of that area is only getting a very small amount of light. 100 milliwatts concentrated into a laser dot, well, that's going to light things on fire, blast holes in things. That's a lot of power concentrated in a tiny space. So the amount of power is only part of the equation. You have to look at how big of an area that power is spread over, and that tells you the dose that any particular spot will receive. And then the other component of dose is time. If you have a high power and you have it spread over a small area, that's a high dose. And then the longer you do it, the more dose that spot is getting. So if you spread power over a very large area and you want to increase dose, you're going to increase time because any particular spot is getting a small dose, but it's cumulative. The longer you treat, the longer time it is, the more power, the more energy is deposited in each cell. So hopefully that makes sense. And often I get asked questions about, well, what power light should I get? And that's not really going to tell me anything I can answer, because you have to tell me the area that it's spread over before I know anything about dose. And in the end, biologically, dose is what matters. So when you look at the power of a light, you also necessarily have to look at the area. And then you consider from there, how much time will you apply the light therapy before you remove it. So power, area, and time, all of those go into dose. With clinical care versus home care, that dose consideration matters. Because you remember my story about my canker sore, and if you have a patient and they have a light therapy device and they're treating at home, there's the temptation to think, well, more must be better. I'm going to keep that thing on 24/7. I'm just going to tape it on there and keep it on, and I'm going to dose and dose and dose. And they can actually have the opposite effect because they're overdosing. Of course, with clinical care, you get to control it. With home care, you need to have a means to make sure that the patient is getting an effective dose and not overdosing. So let's talk about equipment and how to choose the right kind of equipment for what you're hoping to accomplish. First of all, you got to think about purpose. Are you trying to treat for pain control? Are you trying to treat for cosmetic? Are you trying to treat for infection? Today's webinar, we're focusing on pain control. And so I'm going to talk specifically about treating pain and using light as an adjunctive therapy in treating pain. So when you're dealing with light, then you want to consider the type you're going to use, laser or LED. We talked earlier and said that laser is very focused. It's like a needle. It's one spot, a lot of power, versus LED, which is broader, spread over a larger area, deposits less power in any single spot. And then you want to think about wavelength. When you're dealing with pain, if you're not doing laser acupuncture, then my recommendation is go with an LED device. Laser acupuncture devices, that's when you treat an acupuncture point for a specific reason to have a remote effect or sometimes a local effect. And if that's what your purpose is, then a laser is the best thing, hands down. On the other hand, if you're just trying to treat a painful area and you want to spread it over the area, be able to dose all of the cells in the area with the correct dose, then you want LED to do that because it's larger, it's more diffuse, and it gives you better control. Then wavelength. When you're dealing with pain, the two wavelengths you want to look for are red and infrared. In the red spectrum, 635 nanometer, right in that area, is the most effective. That has the effects we talked about, ATP production, nitric oxide production. The infrared, it penetrates more deeply. It improves circulation so that you can have, more nutrition coming in, waste products going out. And it also affects, it modulates pain because of the warmth. It's kind of like putting a hot pack or heat therapy. It's a very comfortable thing to do, and the tissue responds in a positive way. So for pain control, red and infrared are typically the ways to go. Oh, and this is the slide I would have been referring to when I told you all that. So different wavelengths have different applications. Don't assume because it's a light that it's going to do magic simply because it's a light. You have to actually know and be intentional about the wavelength you're using. Okay, so along with purpose, the type, and the wavelength, which we talked about, you want to talk about power, which necessarily means you got to talk about area. If you have a very high powered light, but it's over a very large area, then that power is spread out versus a high powered laser, which is a very concentrated area. Typically, you want enough power that you can get an effective dose in a reasonable length of time. If you have to hold the light there for 5 minutes to get the effective dose, that's not going to be clinically very practical for you to use. And then price. Let's talk about price for just a minute. Because you can get light therapy devices for well under $100. I've searched online, I've seen them, little Chinese-made flashlights with different colors of LEDs, and no rhyme or reason. They have red and green and blue and yellow and infrared, and they just cram them all in there into this light show Christmas tree thing, throw a battery in it and call it a light therapy device and sell it for $19 on Amazon. And it's just the cheapest, most poorly manufactured, unregulated. At that price point, you know that you're getting the cheapest thing that can possibly be built. And no matter what they claim about it, I build these things. I know what quality LEDs cost, and the cheap under $100 equipment simply isn't any good. On the other hand, you can pay over $10,000 for light therapy devices, well over $10,000, and you'll get a very high quality, very well made device that's going to output the very same light as a device that costs 1/10 the price. Because your patient's body, the cells, don't know how much you spent on that device, and nobody's going to tell them. All they know is the wavelength of light that's hitting them. So if you can provide an effective dose at a lower cost with quality components, you should. I was at a medical device show in Florida last year, and they had a number of light therapy devices. It was very popular, very, very hot thing going on. And they had, of course, demos going on constantly. And I noticed a lot of people were walking out of there with light therapy devices. And they were $2,000 and up. But if you buy right now, because it was at the show, then they had like, oh, only $1,800 for this device. And it was exactly, precisely the same as the device that I sell for, somewhere around $400. And it had exactly the same specs, exactly the same output. The difference is that they were selling to an uninformed public. And frankly, I looked at the quality of what they were doing, and although the quality was decent, it was nothing to write home about. Okay, so when you look at the output, you need to know wavelength, power, and area, and then consider your needs and uses, and know what you are buying. Too many times I've seen people buy a light because it's a light. That's fine, but you should be a little more intentional. Spend some time doing homework. It's really not that hard to understand. And hopefully today, this little primer gives you better tools to work with when considering light therapy devices. Now, the devices that we sell, they're called Fotis-o. I'm going to talk about these in a minute, but I want to answer some more questions here because I love it when the questions come in. So let me see, where did we leave off? Are your wavelengths similar to Arconia? Yeah, we talked about that. Where did we go here? How do these compare with the AW lights? I'll cover that one when we get into them. How effective are laser lights on darker skin, or has this been studied? Yeah, laser lights actually are still effective on darker skin. Although there's more pigment, which tends to absorb rather than transmit the light, even darker skin tones, you still get good transmission and good penetration. So although certain wavelengths are blocked by the pigment, ultraviolet, for example, other wavelengths tend to pass right through. Next, how deep does the laser light penetrate into tissues before becoming as diffuse as LED light? William asked that question. That's a great question, William. And I want to tell you up front that that is something that is kind of constantly debated in the scientific circles. It's a little bit hard to measure because you'd have to actually get some kind of a light sensor down into the tissues. And although there have been some in vitro sorts of studies done about how diffuse the light becomes, it's still coherent light. Even though it's no longer collimated, it's still coherent, meaning that it's all in sync. So there's some questions there about when does it ever become like LED light, or does it ever become like LED light? But yes, the fact is it does hit the tissue and it does diffuse, although it still reaches a deeper depth of penetration than light that doesn't start out coherent. Ingrid says, would any kind of light therapy be indicated to treat a fresh fracture? Well, that's interesting. Certainly, the pain, the inflammation, the circulation benefits of light therapy would benefit a fresh fracture. Now, for bone growth, I know of microcurrent applications using electricity that stimulate bone growth very effectively. I've not seen any studies on bone growth and bone repair using light, so I don't want to recommend that, but certainly light would be recommended for the pain, inflammation, swelling, etc. Good questions. All right. Well, let's talk about Fotis-os for a minute. The Fotis-o line is our line of devices. They output red and infrared light. They are LEDs. They're not lasers, so they're eye safe and they're diffuse. They can treat a large, and they're highly effective in what they do. They're made of good quality components. The LEDs they're selected are high quality LEDs that last for years and that output the right kind of light, meaning when they say they're 633 nanometer, that's what you're going to get in a very tight tolerance. You're not going to get something that could be off by 10, 20, 50 nanometers. And you're going to get the power output that they claim. With cheaper LEDs, the power output varies a lot. Some will be bright, some will be dim. With good quality LEDs, you get a very consistent power output, so you know the dose that you're giving. So we have a couple of these. The Fotis-o Vet Care, this is one that we've had for a long time for sale, and it's wonderful. And every time people say, oh yeah, light therapy, that's quackery, that's placebo, then why does it work so well on animals? And there are, testimonial after testimonial. There are lots of these light therapy devices sold in veterinary circles, and they're universally respected and used in veterinary medicine because they work. So the beauty about the Fotis-o devices is you literally push the button, turn it on, you treat the area, and then you repeat for the next area, and you don't have to worry about dose because that's already been done for you. The way that these are powered, they have dosed them so that when you turn on the power, it automatically times it properly and turns off when it's reached the right dose based on the area of the output head. So the power divided by the area equals gives you what you need for time, and that math is for you. So it's literally a point and click interface. You put it on the painful area, you push the button, and it treats. Now the Vet Care, it has lots of great indications because in veterinary world, you can talk about what it'll actually do without having to make FDA approved claims. And so the veterinary, it does a number of things: pain, inflammation, wound care, abscesses, bruising, arthritis, and so on. You can see all of these indications that it can be used for in animals with the Fotis-o Vet Care. With the Fotis-o Pain Relief Unit, that's the one that's used for humans, and we only sell those as indicated for treating pain and the associated symptoms that go with the pain, inflammation, swelling, things like that. It also is indicated for temporarily increasing circulation to an area, like we talked about. Same thing, high power red and infrared, controlled dose over a large area. It's highly effective, and it is the point and click interface, which means that when you press the button and it turns on. Wow, that's bright. Sorry, these do output a lot of light. But when you press the button and it turns on, then it is calculating the dose and it turns off at the proper dose. It's pre-timed and it runs through a pre-timed program so that if you have a patient and you send this home with the patient, they're not going to overtreat. You can teach them all they have to do is put it on the painful area, press the button, and then when it turns off, they're done. If the painful area is large, then they can move it to another spot and treat again. So you can treat one area and then move a little bit, treat the next area, and so on. With this light, you can treat one area here and then move a little bit and treat the next area and move and treat the next area and not overdose. That's what I love about the measured dose. So these are great for home care. They're great for clinical care because they are professional grade. For example, you can get well over 100 treatments before you have to recharge. So you can go through an entire clinical day on one charge, or days, depending on your patient load, before you have to recharge. So it's great for clinical use, very well built, sturdy, it'll last for years. And they're priced in the sweet spot between, on the low end where you get too cheap and you get junk. On the high end, you're just overpaying for somebody's name brand. But in the middle, you're getting the good quality, well-made professional device without having to pay the label tax, shall we say. Excellent for treating pain from inflammation, injuries, muscle pain, joint pain, arthritis, tendonitis, all the itises. So wonderful for sports injuries, helps relax muscle spasms, sprains, strains, shoulder, neck, back, all of the typical pain areas. And it's really kind of focused on musculoskeletal type pain. People say, well, can I treat a headache with it? And the answer is no, you're really not going to, first of all, penetrate the skull. Light's not going to get through there very effectively. But secondly, the cause of a headache may be metabolic in nature. It may be something totally unrelated to a spot on the head. On the other hand, if you have tennis elbow, that's related to something local inflammation, local pain. You want to treat the local tissues. So for musculoskeletal things, the Fotis-o lights are awesome. People always say, well, what's different between the human and the animal? First of all, the treatment program. Do you remember earlier I talked about how you can encode information into the light using frequencies? And the vet care has frequencies specific for animals, and the human one has frequencies specific for humans. And so when you hit the button and turn it on, it actually runs through a program of specific frequencies to have specific effects. And when it finishes the program, it turns off. That's all been built in so that it gives the correct dose and runs the entire frequency program in the 40-second program that it runs. 30 seconds for animals, 40 seconds for humans, because they run different programs. And it's technically 31 seconds and 41 seconds, I should tell you, but 30 and 40 is easier to remember. You can find out more at photisusa.com, and you can choose either the pain relief or the vet care. Both are available. And I'm going to put this up right now where you can actually hop over. You can see what we have on special right now. All our lights come with training videos. So when you get your pain relief, in the box, you'll have, of course, your user manual, you'll have your charger, your pouch to keep it in, but you'll also have the card that tells you how to go get the video training. So we're going to give you all the training that you need to properly, safely use it, and a 60-day money-back guarantee. So if for any reason you don't love it, you don't keep it. You can send it back. And we also have wholesale options available. I talked earlier about how patients can use these devices at home. If you recommend them, if you prescribe the device, they can take it home and use it for themselves. They can buy it from you and own it, which means you can buy them at wholesale and resell to your patients. Or you can just have loaner units. Either way, there's quantity discounts available, And so give us a call if you'd like to talk about those. We'd love to help you get set up with that. And so let's get back to questions and see what else we've got. We've got some good stuff here. Let's see. Therese says, I have been looking at MR5 device, which is way too expensive. They call it super pulsed. What benefit does that give? I'm not familiar with that device. I've heard of super pulsed devices, and essentially they're saying they pulse it on and off to encode information. So without looking at the device specifically, I couldn't tell you more than that. Salil says, any data on using for TBI patients, laser for TBI patients, traumatic brain injury? I have not seen any good studies, but I haven't researched it either. So I'd recommend checking into that, laser for TBI. I have anecdotal things that I could tell you about, but I try to stick with what's been researched when I teach. So yeah, go check into it. Does the laser use feedback to calculate the dose? No, not the laser. If not, how does it differentiate between locations and underlying tissues? So the Fotis-os aren't lasers. So when the Fotis-o calculates dose, it's based on the area and the power. The lasers, on the other hand, the ones that I'm familiar with don't calculate dose, and therefore you have to decide how long to treat with a laser. Jennifer says, how about FDA approval of device? These devices fall into a category that doesn't require FDA quote-unquote approval. Therefore, they are FDA compliant devices. They don't have to be FDA approved because the risk is so low, which is why I love light therapy. You're not going to harm somebody with this. So the FDA says, okay, you can sell these devices if they meet these specifications. We don't have to specifically approve it, which is nice. Cosmetic use. There are lights for cosmetic use. The ones that we sell are not, but we hope to be able to one day offer lights that are designed for that. That's in the works. Great question, Jennifer. Salil says, what about use for chronic sinusitis? Will the depth of penetration reach the sinuses? I would try it for chronic sinusitis, yes. You will, especially the infrared, which is going to cause relaxation, help things open up. I think you'll get great results with it. I would definitely give it a try for that. Of course, because you'll be near the eyes, just for patient comfort, you'll want to make sure that the eye is closed and covered when you're shining in the sinuses so that they're not getting bright red light, just because it won't be comfortable. Next, have you by any chance used light therapy for aphasia? No, I never have. That would be interesting. Obviously, depending on the cause, chances are neurological, of course. I don't know what kind of results you could expect for a lack of function like that. Never tried it. Nikki says, is it safe to use on people with a pacemaker? Yeah, just don't shine it on the pacemaker. So you need to be aware of where the pacemaker is. But the good news is shining light, say up here on a neck, if the pacemaker is down in the abdomen, no light is reaching the pacemaker. It's not going to affect it in any way. Salil says, is it okay to use on my 2-year-old? Yes. Light therapy is available for use on infants. There's no contraindications other than, of course, you want to be mindful of the eyes and so on, because tissue is tissue. And I think about one of the first FDA cleared or medically accepted uses of light therapy where they said, wait, this isn't quackery, it actually works. And that is, of course, on newborns with jaundice, and where they can't process the bilirubin and it can actually cause neurological poisoning. You can break the bilirubin with light. And so I love that. That always inspires me, the fact that you can save a newborn infant's life with nothing more than the right kind of light. So William says, are you selling laser or just LEDs? We do have lasers available. Hit our store at meridiatech.com, and you can check out our lasers there as well. And I don't see any other questions right now. Oh, well, there we go. I was asking questions. And it looks like we have hit the end of our hour. I hope that you found today's webinar informative and useful and helpful. If you have any specific questions, then feel free to call me, call my staff. We're glad to talk to you, glad to answer. And meanwhile, I hope you will check out the Fotis-o devices. I think they're absolutely wonderful. I think you'll love them. Your patients will love them as well. Oh, quickly, we got more questions. Good. What is the percentage of effectiveness of Fotis-o for male hair restoration? It's not indicated for that, and so we can't claim that it does anything for hair restoration. I've seen lights that do, so you might want to look into one of those. Sue says, can you use it on the jugular to treat viruses? No, not indicated for viruses. First of all, wrong wavelength. Secondly, we can't make claims beyond what the FDA allows, and so we're certainly not going to claim that it treats viruses. But if you were treating viruses, you wouldn't want to use these wavelengths. These are for healing, ATP production, pain control. Oh, yeah, comparing to the Alight. Alight is excellent. The Alights are high quality, wonderful tools. The difference, you asked about the difference, and that is that the Fotis-o lights output 2 wavelengths, not 1. They have red and infrared LEDs, both simultaneously. The Alight only outputs 1, it's only red. And then simultaneously, the Fotis-o lights have encoded frequencies where they're encoding information in the light as they treat. Specific frequencies for specific effects. The Alight is not a frequency-based device. It's simply on or it's off. So that's the differences. And the Alights, like I said, I love them, I use them, but they don't have as many features or capabilities as the Fotis-os. And does it automatically select the frequency? Yes, it runs through a pre-programmed set of frequencies designed for a pre-programmed set of effects. So it will run the ones that are most useful for things like pain, inflammation, and so on as the program. And it's all automatic. All you have to do is push the button. And nobody asked, but I wanted to reiterate the the Fotis-o lights are rechargeable. So you simply plug them in, they charge in a couple of hours, you're ready to treat. You don't have to mess with changing batteries, taking them apart, anything like that. And did you mention what frequencies are encoded? I did not. I did not mention the specific frequencies, kind of a proprietary thing. We're not publishing those specific frequencies, but it runs through a whole program of a dozen or more inside that 40 seconds. All right, everybody. Well, thank you so much for attending today. Again, if you have any further questions, please reach out to me or to my staff. Please do check out the Fotis-os and find out the specials that we have going. I think you'll really like them. And until next time, I'm Dr. Larson signing off. Thanks again. Wish you all the best in your practice. Go out there and make a difference.